sometimes all the new stuff they release for us, I can feel very bored because every time when I play these things, I usually think about the normal or those common things people might want to play about. So I try to turn back on those old Warframes that we already had. And you know what I found? Nezha actually very good, but I'm not really see people talk about that much, at least from my perspective. Especially when I try to look at some of the abilities, somehow they can become offensive. But I never really play that way. So for this time around, I managed to make Nezha into a very offensive Warframe that can do all the works by himself, except a slight preparation is still viable. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. The ability that we'll be focusing on here is the second ability, Blazing Chakram. You see, the Chakram doesn't just only manage to hit through enemies, but it provides a few buffs that most people might already know, which is damage vulnerability and extra drop chance towards health and energy off. But one thing that most people may not know is that the augment Ripping Chakram can buff the damage of the Chakram a lot if the Chakram can hit multiple enemies. The more it hits, the more damage it can have. But the problem is that how do we amplify the damage through the Chakram bounces? This is where we will be relying on the fourth ability, Divine Spears. You see, when Chakram hit on the enemies affected by Divine Spear, it can split into several Chakram. And based on what I could tell, it somehow can affect the damage a lot. But do remind, when you use the Charged Chakram hitting those enemies that are affected by the Divine Spear, they won't split. So this build will only focus on trying to use the base and not the charge shot. Of course, Blazing Chakram use heat damage, and for our damage output, we need to focus on two things, the heat dodge damage and the armor problem. Let's take a look at the armor problem first. Despite we know that heat proc can reduce a maximum of 50% of the remaining armor, it's still not enough. That is why we need to make sure that it can completely strip off the armors before we deal damage. Among all of them, aside from using the honorary focus skill or the Vessela, which is somehow very gimmicky for some point, I found a much easier way, which is just by replacing Firewalker into Terrify, since Terrify are the easiest way to strip armor without too much of the problem. Especially Firewalker doesn't really contribute that much. The only thing that it can contribute is that the Chakram can have the explosion damage, which somehow this is what not we're focusing on. As for the damage output, we'll be relying on the Hit Inherit build. For those that who might not know about this, hit dodge damage do a slightly different compared to the other dodge damage. Most dodge damage can do their own separate damage based on the stacks they have, but hit dodge damage do exactly opposite, where it will compile all the hit status proc it has and compile it into a single status proc and do the high damage. What's so interesting here is that we know that for this dodge damage, we'll be relying on the element and the faction damage to do the double dips damage. But for Hit Inherit, what's so interesting here is that one of the hit and the faction damage mod will not use from your current weapons. Instead, they will be depending on the first step of the hit and the faction mod, which is why you can see here we call it as Hit Inherit, where it will inherit the first stack until your current hit procs damage, which is why the first status proc is the important one for us, as we need to get the maximum damage through our first status proc. So for our Nezha build here, this is what it will be looks like. Now the one thing you can notice here very obvious is the Excellent Slug will be using the Control Slide augment instead of Prime Surefooted. The reason why we're using this augment is that his passive is just almost useless in most scenarios. So I was thinking that rather than keep this useless passive, why don't we just change it into the Extra Strike for ourselves? After all, the Extra Slide doesn't really contribute that much. And for our aura, I'm using Energy Siphon because there's not really much I can do for, especially the initial energy that I have here right now is only sufficient enough to cast a single Warding Halo and or Blazing Chakram, which we will need to use later on. Ripping Chakram, the augment, this is a must, and because of how we'll be relying on our Blazing Chakram to let the enemies drop extra health and energy off, this also means that Equilibrium build will provide the maximum benefit that we will be using. And this also means that running Blind Rage will be no problem since we know that the energy will be replenished back in no time. And this also means that we can use Prime Flow to expand our maximum energy. For our strike, I'm using Blind Rage, Umbra Intensify, and Energy Conversion. Due to the fact that Blazing Chakram also can drop extra energy off, somehow Energy Conversion can activate almost in all time, as well as Fog Elemental because I want to push the strike as high as possible. For my defensive part, I have adaptation and Archon Vitality. Now, one thing to note is that you don't really need to run a full ranked Archon Vitality. Just an unranked Archon Vitality is already enough, because what we want here is just only the extra hit status prop you can get from your abilities. But because of how I'm using the Umbra Forma for my Umbra Intensify, this is why I can run a full mount. If you don't have the Umbra Forma, you can just use the unranked or partially ranked. But for my case, I want to make it into a health tanky frame with the help of Warding Halo. This is absolutely worth it. And this also means that I'm using Arcane Guardian because Warding Halo, much like Rhino's Iron Skin, not just only scale through strength, but also armor. As for my primers, I'm using the generic secondary primer Epitaph. So for the build here, the main thing here is that we need to have a fashion mod and a heat mod. And for this case, I'm using Prime Expel and the Prime Heated with the 6060 heat mod. Other mods are very optional, but it's also very useful, which is include the status duration, blast radius, and of course I modded viral for the extra viral proc from your primer. And this is my Nezha Chakram build. To be honest, I don't really know about all Warframe whether they will need extra care or not, but based on what I can tell, at least most of them still have their own niche and very fun to play. It's just that because of our current meta and the common interest we have right now, you don't really see people play that much. Especially when I take a look back at this Nezha, I feel like almost all the time I'm just using the Blazing Chakram for the supportive role, but never use it for offensive side. This is why I think that this is very fun to play. At least from what I could tell, somehow you just have to be more creative to create something that you wanted to try. At least this is what makes me able to play this game without feeling a slight burnout, at least for now. If this is your first time watching, why not leave a like and subscribe to my channel so that you won't miss out any news contents from me. Why not leave your comments down below if you got any ideas or thoughts you want to share with all of us. And that's it from me, and as always, I will see you all next time. Bye bye!